9 o'clock in the morning on Tuesday the 23rd of October 1915. That was 15 months into World War I and 8 months after the ultimately failed Balkans campaign had begun. The British troopship Marquette, carrying 741, was sunk by a German submarine 70 kilometres off the coast of Salonika, Greece. This was one of the great sea tragedies of the Great War, New Zealand's version of the Lusitania sinking in May of that year. For amongst the 163 who lost their lives when the Marquette was sunk were 10 New Zealand nurses, 19 members of the medical corps and 3 servicemen. In total, 32 New Zealand victims. Like most tragedies of this scale, there were a series of mistakes that combined together, combinating into the actual event. Most, if not all of them, were kept from the public at large at the time. Instead, the sinking and deaths of innocent South Island nurses and medical staff proved to be a propaganda boom back home, in a country which sent per head of population more troops into the trenches than even the British. Recruitment campaigns were spawned off the belief that the wicked Hun had deliberately sunk a vessel that was designated as neutral, a hospital ship. Check out the banner on the tram in Christchurch Cathedral Square. Most of which was simply propaganda and testimony to the famous adage. Today I have divided the video into the vessels involved. As there's not been a lot said about the German side of the story, I've included the submarine as well, leading into what were amongst the litany of mistakes that led to the sinking. Lastly, the permanent memorial that was built in Christchurch to immortalise the victims. Let's start with the Marquette. The 150 metre long steamship Marquette was built in Scotland in 1897 and for the first 2 years was called the Boadicea. That was until the shipping company that commissioned her ran out of money and she became part of the Red Star Line plying the transatlantic. At the start of World War I, she was requisitioned for the war effort, doing what she was designed to do in civilian life, that's to say move cargo and passengers. The submarine that launched the fatal torpedo was SM U-35. U-35 remains the most successful submarine to ever grace the seas, above and below, and that record is likely to remain forever. You will be nodding in agreement with me in about 15 seconds. U-35's captain, and excuse me if I butcher his name, it's a bit of a mouthful, was Lothar van Arnu de la Perriere. Points from 10. Perriere remains the most successful submarine captain ever as well. Incredibly, he sunk 220 merchants and military ships, most of those with his 88mm deck gun. During his vast career, Perriere fired just 74 torpedoes, striking 39 times. 2 of those kills were battleships. The Marquette was the 26th vessel he would sink or damage. The hand of fate, therefore, was not on the side of those on the Marquette that dull grey morning, running into this particular submarine with arguably the best commander in the world. In case you were wondering, Perriere survived World War I and went into planning advisory role in World War II, where he died in an aeroplane crash in France, 1941. Amongst New Zealand's contribution to the First World War were 2 converted Trans-Tasman Union steamship vessels that became floating hospitals. The Mahino, pictured, came online in 1914. Marama a few months into 1915. Both would play roles in the Gallipoli campaign, treating the wounded and ferrying the long-term patients to the Greek mainland and even back to NZ. During the war, between the 2 vessels, they attended and transported over 50,000. Those black and white photos don't do justice to their embellishments. In accordance with the Hague Convention, they were painted in white, adorned with red crosses, and even had a green stripe round the middle for good measure. What U-35 encountered through their periscope, however, was a grey enemy troopship, and as such was fair game. There should have been no medical personnel transported on troop ships, full stop, particularly one carrying munitions as well, when there were, after all, hospital vessels, the neutrality of which both sides respected, available. Specifically the British hospital ship, the Brutality Castle, that departed Alexandria the day before the Marquette and played a role rescuing survivors. The Brutality Castle was, after all, half full. It had space for 200 more. That was one revelation that came out in a rushed British inquiry that took place only 3 days after the sinking, when most, if not all, of the witnesses were either in shock, traumatised, or both. In response to this, an insipid letter was penned by the then Governor-General of New Zealand, Lord Liverpool, to London, and that read,
"In view of the loss of the Marquette, my government would be glad if the arrangements could be made whereby a medical unit should, where possible, be transported by sea in a hospital ship."
You talk about hand-wringing and understatement. The so-called inquiry failed to answer any of the major questions. It was mere tokenism, little more than a whitewash. For example, the inquiry never did address just why the French escort destroyer, the Terre, similar to the one on your screen, up and left the Marquette the night before she was torpedoed. The most probable reason was the French captain thought she was home and hosed. And then we also have the chaotic evacuation of the sinking ship. In a story familiar to those that have seen the film The Titanic, the lifeboat system was incapable of safely dropping the boats into the ocean once the vessel listed too far. Some of the dead were killed when one lifeboat fell on top of another. The majority of victims perished due to exposure rather than outright drowning, and that was due to the woeful design of what was then called life belts. 4 of the New Zealand nurses were told that they were to wait on deck for the next lifeboat just 60 seconds odd before it sank, rather than being told to swim for your life. All were sucked under when the ship went down, miraculously 2 survived. Then there was the thorny issue that for every subsequent tale of heroism recounted by the survivors, there was another whereby it was every man for themselves. Order broke down, and it was far from the picture of women and children first. No mention in the official records of the lifeboat occupants that ignored the cries of those in the water. None of which would have made great reading back here in New Zealand. If it wasn't already bad enough, bubbling under the surface of all of this debacle was that the New Zealand military chiefs, as well as New Zealand Red Cross, had strenuously partitioned the British. They wanted their medical land base in the Mediterranean to be situated on Lemnos and not Salonika. That was because they perceived it as being safer. The final indignity in terms of the inquiry was that post-war, when the files became available for historians and journalists to pore over, many of the critical documents were found to be missing. And by the way, this video is the most concise coverage one can get on YouTube regarding the sinking of the Marquette as at its publication, November 2021. Support for small independent labour of love channels like this one will ensure stories like this won't be buried. The 1915 sinking was still fresh in the minds of New Zealanders when in 1927 a chapel dedicated to all the nurses that died in World War I was erected. With such a strong connection to the South Island for the 10 nurses that perished, it went up on the side of the Christchurch Hospital after a nationwide fundraising campaign. The Memorial Chapel was one of so many buildings that were damaged badly in the 2011 earthquake, and another fundraiser undertaken to save the building from the bulldozer. This was no easy task, given hundreds of other heritage buildings in the city were similarly placed. I am pleased to report it reopened in 2018. You'll also see a link to the website dedicated to the history of the Nurses' Chapel on your screens. Thanks for stopping by here today. I trust you will now stay for an extra 30 seconds as we pay tribute to all the Kiwis that lost their lives on that day in 1915. Bye for now.